All right, the floor's open for questions. Has anyone got some questions? Ross Williams, where are you? You told me you had a question for Bryson earlier. Did you want to start with that one?
Yes, I was... I was wondering about the effect of La Nina on our weather systems on the west coast. We've had one series of dry years and then a very wet year, an average year, and we should all be in a La Nina weather pattern. Have you got any ideas or conclusions of what the La Ninas, are they coming more regularly, or will it go back to a more normal pattern?
I think one of the problems with climate variability is there's no such thing as a normal pattern. Climate varies, whatever timescale you look at, climate will vary over that timescale. In terms of the impact of La Nina here, I remember way back in the start of the Indian Ocean Climate Initiative, I don't know whether you know Brian Sadler. He did some analysis and he found that the wetter years here in the southwest were La Nina years. But I don't think that piece of work has been really picked up. I've been involved in some work looking at lightning-ignited bushfires in the Warren region, and you can actually see some of the analysis we've done there. You can see there is an El Nino influence. What that is in terms of rainfall or groundwater, I can't really say without repeating the analysis. But some people seem to think we're completely independent over here of El Nino, but I'm not convinced that that's exactly the case. I think there's some dependence, but whether it's weak or strong, we'll have to wait and see. And I've got no idea. I mean, everyone was talking about, not too long ago, about the preponderance of El Ninos to La Ninas, and now we're in a period with multiple La Ninas. I think that's just the nature of climate variability, really.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
I suppose I'm old enough to recall the previous land monitor, which provided an estimate of the area, sort of, and I forget the right terminology, but the area at risk of salinity, and so is there an estimate been made of the area that's at risk of becoming, high water table or salt affected? I think it was like 4 or 5 million hectares previously.
So we didn't redo that part of the analysis, John. It's actually, we call it the average height above valley floor, or the salinity hazard. It was 2.4 to 4 point something million. This was the number, and no, we didn't redo that part, and we'll need to revisit that, and it's going to be in conjunction with our groundwater trend analysis, and I think Paul was going to finish off with that bit.
I was pretty much going to say the same thing, that the hazard area we know is an envelope. We know it's, especially in the wheat belt, it goes much higher up the lower slopes of trunk valleys, but it tends not to go high enough up catchments. But when you get higher in the landscape, the valleys narrow down, and it's just a consequence of that. It's a DEM-based product, but it overestimates the area.
I've got a question here. Would panellists like to say whether they are optimistic or pessimistic about the South Coast's ability to deal with climate change and rising groundwater levels? Judgment call from a panel of experts.
I've been involved in climate change research since 1991, and this would be one of the strongest responses I've seen, where people perceive there is a threat. They want to know the details of the threat, and there seems to be some sort of vibe around this room that people really do want to do something about it. I mean, it wasn't that long ago there was an attitude, oh, we'll wait it out and see. But I don't think people realise once these processes start gaining some momentum, they continue on. And the time to act is now. And there's plenty of things we can do now, so why don't we just get on with it?
Any of the other panellists? Don? This is your question that you wrote
Yeah,
down
I
for me.
know, but I wanted to hear what everyone else had to say. But look, I haven't seen any or very little farmer change of land use that wasn't economic. So there was an awful lot of interest in putting perennials in the system, but it was only when those perennials were economic that they get applied over a large area. And what was really striking to me was that we were planting out small parts of the upper Denmark catchment to try and improve the water quality in the Denmark River. Blue gums came along, and all the areas that weren't planted to blue gums, because we thought we'll have some normal agriculture in there, because blue gums were more economic, they took over the whole of the upper catchment and the Denmark River improved. And I saw, surprisingly, the tributaries of the Kent have actually improved as well. I had been surprised, but there was a paper, published by a few people just recently saying even the Kent had turned around, which was actually a surprise to me. I didn't think the Kent would in my lifetime. So there are some good things, but it really comes down to a bit like things on climate change. If it's economic, it's a bit like, will people use renewable resources and things like that? They will if it's economic, but if it's really uneconomic, it is really difficult to get them to be adopted on the scale that's required.
I think one of the interesting changes that's happening is that ESG, environmental sustainable governance or social governance, has really taken off. So companies in the ASX are needing to report against that metric, and most European and US-based stock exchanges are increasingly moving towards that. So that creates an opportunity for new enterprises in a way that we haven't experienced before. So alternative mechanisms and alternative planning strategies could start come to the fore, particularly in areas that aren't economic with the present systems that we have. So, in terms of am I optimistic, I'm going to say yes.
Good commitment there, Roger.
I'll add one thing. I did an environmental science degree in the early 80s. In the mid to late 70s, there was a lot of talk about human population as a main driver of environmental degradation and risk. And China was the only country that tried to do anything about it, and that didn't work out very well. So I believe the total number of human beings on the planet is actually an issue that we probably should be facing, and I do not know how we deal with that. In the short term, I'm very optimistic because I think there's still a lot we can do, but if we don't do something about how many of us there are, then maybe the future isn't quite so rosy in the long term. And I don't like feeling pessimistic because I'm a natural optimist.
I get accused of being a pessimist. I think I'm a realist. But I'm actually opportunist. I think there's opportunity on the South Coast, and I think it gets back to what Don said. It's about economic options. We're in a high rainfall, we've got sandy environments, even though we don't have a lot of groundwater resources, we've got a lot of fresh water going to them. We've got opportunity, we've got ports, both ends, we've got containerisation. I think there's some of that brackish to slightly saline resource. Once the technology's proven up, will be able to be used, treated and used. I can see closed agriculture, a lot more of that coming in. I think there is opportunity out there, and I think some of it, in terms of the beef industry in particular, I've always saw the South Coast as having opportunity for perennially based farming systems. When you see these wet, waterlogged paddocks, you're thinking, why not just, use it, looking at that land use capability and farming to the capability, and there's one thing that got me as a young career, my early career, was, didn't matter where we went. I was based in Moora. It was wheat and sheep, wheat and sheep, wheat and sheep. And there was just this constant push for the same system. And then all of a sudden Tagisasti came in, the beef prices went up, and people started thinking, you know, out near Hooniabba and Jurien Bay, that, you know, those landscapes didn't lend themselves to wheat and sheep. And they started doing Tagisasti, perennial pastures and a beef system. So, but it has to have that economics to drive it. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
I'm feeling the optimism. I think Bryson just wants to... Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing. There was a few years ago, I used to have a senior role in CSIRO's climate adaptation flagship, and there was a talk of looking for the low-hanging fruit, which I think is following up on what Don said. And basically, are there things I can do now that's going to help me in the future, but I can make money out of it right now? Mm-hmm. And you often find with a bit of thought that's not as difficult as this might sound. There's things you can do that you'll make money now, but you'll safeguard yourself in terms of the future.
Mm. Great, thank you. we're going to go to Murray and then Dion.
I've got two questions, but I've also got a comment. Look, the one question was about the high salinity rating in the Esperance area in particular, particularly below the Jarrawood axis. I was very interested in that. The other one was to Bryson, was to do with wind speed and direction. You didn't bring any stats forward on that, and particularly in relationship to has that increased, and those directional changes made it far more difficult for the drying process that you talked about. And look, the other thing, when you were talking about optimism, my challenge is to everybody in this room, and it's going to come out tomorrow because I'm going to get up and say it, you know, it's about social licence. We're going to have to solve the whole issue around social licence and agriculture in particular. It hasn't been really put forward, and it hasn't really been fleshed out. But to continue to be optimistic about things, we've got to have to settle the whole issue around social licence.
All right, a few questions and comments there, and it looks like a number of panellists will have some responses.
Yes, so the Esperance Sandplain, it's a big hydro zone, and it's why it comes up high is it's relatively new agricultural land, so it's about 50 years behind the Eastern Wheat Belt and some of the older cleared lands, and it's still filling. And what I'm finding is those areas that don't have external drainage, it's internally drained, and when you look at the water balance, there's no water part of that. Rainfall has to equal, you know, runoff, plant water use, evaporation and recharge, and you've basically taken the runoff component of that out. So if it's not going up as plant water use or evaporation, it's going in. And unfortunately, I've got some horrendous rates of rise in some of those areas, which gave it the likelihood is, yeah. Do you want to ask this question about the wind?
In terms of the winds, I did have a slide on that. What I did find going through the analysis, I was looking at what they call the zonal and the meridional winds. The zonal wind is sort of from the south to the north is positive, and that's the meridional. Zonal is positive when you go from east to west, and what I did find was certainly those westerly winds were decreasing in speed. It was quite obvious. I mean, there's a lot of scatter in the data, but when you look at the data, there's definitely a decrease there, which is consistent with the sort of stuff I've been saying.
Okay. Letitia, can we get a mic up to Dion there? The next question.
Thanks.
I suspect we'll have a lot of comment on that. Dion, can you hold on just for a second? We'll explore that.
So the social licence falls under the ESG comment that I made earlier. So it's certainly recognised that it's rising. You only need to look at the European requirements on their farming community. Having said that, in a recent trend, so some of you may have been aware of the press around a product called glyphosate or Roundup. So that trend has reversed in the last 12 months. from government agencies. An example is in Denmark. They backtracked their attitudes towards it when they suddenly realised they were going to starve and they were going to run out of food. So there's a bit of pragmatism now kicking in with the attitudes around changing chemicals. Having said that, Australia still has a lot of chemicals that have available that have been banned in places like the US. So I don't know how much longer we'll still be able to use things like atrazine. But every other farming system in the world has adapted to that. I'd expect we'd do the same. So I'm still optimistic.
Would any other panellists like to converse on the ESG? Not at the moment, but yeah, look forward to exploring that tomorrow by the sounds of it. Over to you, Dion.
I guess my question follows on from the social licence bit in some way. Yesterday when we were out on Richard's farm, we were talking about plantations and that plantation companies have to demonstrate good environmental management through their Forestry Stewardship Council certification. And so that to be able to get that certification onto their product, because that's what the market demands. And it's been born out of the Rainforest Alliance and clearing of rainforests. But it provides a framework to take it out of the category of being voluntary, and so that voluntary social licence to placing some obligation or some certification around how agriculture and resource use is using those resources and managing those resources for the broader good. I guess my question to the panellists is: do you see how do you see agriculture in relation to a certification process? Do you think there's a role or a possibility of that encourages better land management and in essence better resource management at the broader scale?
You go first, Roger, and I'll say a few things if you like.
Yeah, so there are trends, particularly in horticulture, about setting up tracking processes and registration processes where you effectively can monitor product from the farm through to the packing house, and then it's monitored through the transport routes and then all the way to the shelf. Interestingly, the crop that we are developing technology where you can sense the crop with handheld sensors and trace it from the source all the way to the end user, that we're doing the most work on at the moment is in cannabis, because it's being legalised in the US. So we actually have contracts through New York looking at that state's regulatory process, and once you can get something up and running that works in one agricultural production system, it's usually, well, you've proved the concept then, and then it's just a case of how do you enable that to operate across all agricultural sectors. So again, it's a technology that is being worked on quite actively.
Would any of the other panellists like to respond to that? I guess from a farmer's point of view, we find a lot of the bulk commodities that we're producing do have certification requirements. So for example, through the international sustainability, I can't remember the other two letters, ISCC. So if we're selling into the European market our canola and just more recently barley, there is actually a protocol around that, and there are environmental metrics for that, and it's a requirement to access the premium at the moment. And what we usually find from my short-lived farming career is that there'll be a premium, but then there's an expectation and it's no longer a premium. An example from a meat product is the grain-fed beef market. So the National Feedlot Accreditation Scheme has about 5 modules, and one of those is strictly about environment. So there's definitely industry pressure to improve environmental stewardship, But we also have banking sectors, insurance sector, also with the ESG requirements, exerting a little bit more pressure in that space as well. So, yeah, lots of levers and drivers and opportunities. I think we've got time for another question. And Don's given me a couple, so I might use another one of those. Yeah. So, very well-formed questions. And it will lead us into their workshop, because at the end of the day, can we do it all? We need to choose which assets to save and allow others to be lost. Can we adopt a triage approach? Should we? And just general feedback on that. How do we prioritise? It's a big landscape.
It's good. This is a loaded question. we did this. We had to do this in the noughties. We actually looked at the top 90 biodiversity assets in the state to protect from salinity in the salinity investment framework. It was $1 billion to save them. And that's when the state realised a little bit of money all over wasn't going to do the job. We need strategic, targeted investment, and those hard decisions have to be made, unfortunately. If you're not doing a targeted investment, we used to call it the Vegemite approach. You know, just spread it thin all over the place and hope for the best. It even got to a stage where we used to call it hot honey because you could spread it thinner and farer. You really do need that strategic approach, specifically for salinity management.
Have you asked Mark McGowan what the size of the budget surplus is?
Well, I'm advocating that the South Coast is the priority, so bring it all down here. Any further responses to Don's question? Will we need to choose which assets? It looks like we've got agreement across the panel on that one.
How about asking that question to the audience?
That's a great idea, John. Thank you. How does everyone feel about that? How do we... we'll explore it more, like I said, in the workshops. Prioritisation is one of the themes we want to explore with you all. How does that make you feel, that you have to pick and choose?
I think that's the reality everybody can see out in front of us. And that's, you know, deeply depressing and brings on extraordinary grief that as humans we couldn't... Don, your comment that we just... we function by, are we going to get profit from it? We don't actually make decisions which we know would be good for the land, good for our community health, but industry and markets seem to just direct the way our farming business has operated. I was going to come back to Paul. We haven't got a problem with overpopulation in our rural communities, since I think that's still declining at a constant rate, and I don't see any turnaround on that one either. So, yeah, which towns do we save? Which ones do we just let go? The schools, which ones do we shut down? So, yeah, when I was at the National Landcare Conference, the idea came up, you know, are we going to have to start zoning places? You know, humans will live in this farming area, but over here it'll just be mechanised and let go to salt, and just... It was a pretty depressing little conversation to have. Yep.
So we can lift up from that, and yeah, there is a bit of pragmatism and reality, but I'm actually going to throw to my colleague, Michael Wysong. Where are you? Mike? Is he in the room? And maybe Sarah and Dion can help out here, making sure I say the right things, but we, from a threatened species and threatened ecological communities point of view, the Australian government have prioritised 20 places, and I just found out today that the Fitzgerald within our own South Coast is actually one of them nationally. So there is hope, and there is a focus on our area, and that's really something, an opportunity for us all, for a range of different things: environment, social, economic, social capital. There you go. Thanks, Murray. Really important point there.
Yeah,
Dion?
Johanna, yeah, I was just going to say the priority places, having two that hit the South Coast is fantastic. It's not everything that's important, and I've been inspired listening to people who understand what's going on under the ground, and I think, Simo, you'll agree, you know, when Tilo did that stuff with the Esperance wetlands, when we all thought the Warden catchment was completely buggered, and he showed us this vision of what happened millions of years ago, and just those insights give you some optimism that if we all put our heads together, perhaps we can make a difference. And I know it's really hard in the climate we live in, but you've got to keep some optimism, otherwise you'd just bloody give up, wouldn't you? And that's just me.
And Dion? Thanks, Sarah.
I think consistency is a real challenge. Like Simo said, that in the noughties there was a whole range of prioritisation processes applied through the Salinity Action Plan. We had recovery catchments identified for protection of biodiversity in the wheat belt. And then we had a global financial crisis, and we had efficiency dividends, and we had budget reductions, and we lost a lot of that action and that direction and that prioritisation. And since then we've had we've gone back to almost the Vegemite approach. I'm not sure if we're quite at honey yet, John, but we've just had a change of government at the national level, and when the Threatened Species Commissioner was over here, what she was saying was that she was pushing really hard with the new government not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, not to start from scratch, because we often see that and we get a change of government. They don't want to adopt the previous policies or programs from the previous government, and we have a new prioritisation process or a new program that changes the priorities, or we lose some of the priorities that we have in documents like what they remain priorities in some prospects, but that they don't then have avenues for funding or investment into those priorities. And something like a sustainability framework or a strategy or a policy in Western Australia that includes natural resource management and prioritises areas and recognises that in the triage approach that we're going to have to let some areas go or redirect the resources and the people in those areas to other areas or other opportunities that are more sustainable in the longer term.
Thanks, Dion. Yeah, certainly that continuity is a big challenge. But here we stand, a 30-year-old regional strategy as well. So I'm grateful that the region's got that behind it and a positive and optimistic future ahead of us. So can everyone join me in thanking our... Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, with the carbon sequestering, I was just hoping maybe, we don't have the technology to go green and, convert it all to batteries and solar cells and all the rest of it, and we'll be continuing to use gas and oil. I was just wondering if we could maybe make the big billion-dollar corporations to fund trees in the ground, basically, to stop salinity from getting out of hand and also sequester carbon. I think that's a good economic incentive for farmers to get on board, maybe, by getting big corporations on board, yeah.
Does anyone want to make a comment back to that comment? See that as an opportunity, one of many in the toolbox for farmers going forward, a market driver? Don?
Yeah, actually, I am optimistic about that in some ways because the farmers that are going over to cropping have got about 10 to sometimes 20% of their land that's non-arable, and they don't have stock on them anymore. So there is an opportunity here to actually revegetate whole strips of land. Because they don't care too much about what's on those lands, and if there is an incentive for them, if there's a carbon credit for them, or at least some annuity that they can get by putting 20% of their farm back under a perennial, then everyone wins from that. And I just think this is a huge opportunity because there was so many times during the Landcare movement where all we wanted to do was get enough money to fence out creeks and bush. Now we don't need to fence out creeks and bush if there's nothing eating them. So we don't need to fence them so much. So it's never going to be so cheap to actually get vegetation back into non-arable areas.
Paul, did you want to add anything further there? You sort of went like this with the mic.
On the revegetation front, I'm not saying that it's not a good thing to do, but we need to temper our expectations of what revegetation with woody perennials will do for salinity. We have enough data to show that generally you need to revegetate more of a catchment than is at risk to save what's at risk. So if you're going to revegetate, you need to do it for more than just salinity mitigation. So you want multiple. If you're going to revegetate, you want multiple benefits from it.
I think it's interesting to see. It will be interesting to see how that carbon market develops over time. And I think what myself as a farmer is very interested to see is what our obligations for paying any potential future taxes are. So whilst it might be an opportunity right now to go in, plant the carbon, sell the offsets, how much am I liable for in the future for operating that farm? So that's an unknown at the moment.
I might just add something to that point. In a highly landscape with a high salinity risk, you might want to be very careful where you plant vegetation that you guarantee is going to stay there for the long term and lock up carbon. Because if you sign up for providing ongoing, having carbon locked away in the long term, and you stick it in the wrong part of the landscape, then you might be liable for a lot of dead vegetation and carbon that's not locked up anymore. So you really need to do your homework. If as a landholder you want to go down that route, then be very careful about what parts of the landscape you choose to put vegetation in, and make sure you choose the right vegetation for the right part of the land.
I think this will be our final question. Thanks, Vicky. Grab a microphone. Yep.
This is more of a comment, really, in that one value of vegetation that hasn't been touched on is amenity value and the social well-being, or just your personal well-being you get from driving through an attractive landscape rather than something that looks more like a desert. I mean, you were talking about if the only value of vegetation is to tackle salinity, but and you talk about putting it in the right places in the landscape. I think you're coming from the perspective of it actually surviving, but I think you can make the landscape look a whole lot better. That makes the individual farmer feel happier as he drives up and down his driveway each day, which makes the tourist want to come back to that area because it's an attractive agricultural landscape that they are travelling through. And I mean, I think touching on the fellow over there, the value of any vegetation from, carbon sequestration, I don't know the figures, whether that is significant, but I think that the amenity value of vegetation is something that hasn't been touched on and should be considered.